On behalf of Jim Van Cleve, Barry Abernathy, Johnny Dowdle, and Alan Perdue, I'm Steve Gully. Let us say we're Mountain Heart and we love you with all of ours. Thank you so much. Midnight train, get me home on time. That's what we say. God bless you.
From Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, for the last generation, you have a choice.
the Republican candidate for
not
governor.
have sexual relations
and
with
I
that
realize that this is something he is
We're not going to be able to solve our problems if we get distracted by sideshows and carnival barbers.
One Republican, one Democrat, and you discuss the issues that matter in today's local, state, national, and global politics. Hosted by Steve Hickson with co-hosts John Stanberry and Franklin Chansey. This is Backfire.
Hey, good morning, Cleveland. This is the Doberman, and I'm glad to be back. I missed last week. Got John Stanberry and Franklin Chansey in our studios this morning, as usual.
We talked about you a lot while you were gone. Yeah.
Well, I bet you did. I hope things went well. How'd the show go last week, guys?
Well, with all your texting in, it went real well. You may not have been aware of you were texting in.
Well, good. Anyway, you know, I've kind of been out of touch. I've been traveling for a week, and I didn't even pick up a newspaper, didn't even watch a news show, anything for that week. And then I came in. I've had some issues here, so I'm really not up to par, but I've been trying to get up to par this morning on certain things. I was looking at an article in Thursday's banner that I had saved at county schools to pay $1.4 million over 30 months. And it's basically, I guess, something to do with that tax dispute that has been going on. Is that right?
Yeah, the story, as I've been told, and we talked about it a little bit last week, was that the county got some bad information from the state that the school portion of the tax wouldn't be part of the dispute. When the court decisions came down, it was, and so the county had not put that $1.5 million that went to the school system, had not put it back. They had gone into the school budget. Now that's nothing that the school officials did. They didn't.
Right.
They just were given the money and said, "Here, this is for you." And so that means that the county had to cough up this money in order to pay it back to the city. It appears that they've reached some accommodation between the school board and the county for how they're going to come up with that money.
Well, they're going to pay back over 30 months, $50,000 a month.
That's a big hit for the school system. That's
well,
for sure.
and in this particular case, it's not the county commission's fault either. You know, they asked for an opinion from the guys who should have known, got an opinion, acted on that opinion, and then when the lawsuit came down, the judge said, "Sorry, but that opinion's wrong. You got to pay it all back."
Yeah, you know, it seems to me like I'm just going back through memory right now, but when I was looking at all this and there was a dispute there, I thought that basically Mike Smith was supposed to sit on all the money up there until a decision was made.
Well, it's my understanding that they asked the state for some advice, and the state told them that this portion of the tax would not be subject to having to be paid back if they lost. And so they could take that part of it. Mm-hmm. The rest of it he was keeping, and Mike was certainly doing what he was advised to do. I don't think there's any dispute about that. Yeah. But, you know, obviously it was a mistake.
Well, the money is actually treated differently. The money that's allocated to schools is treated differently than the money that's allocated to go into the general fund. And that's the ruling they got from the state, that because of that, the money that goes to the schools wouldn't be subject to the lawsuit. And so they acted on that. Mike kept everything that the state told him needed to be kept and protected it. And when the lawsuit came down, he had everything ready to go. Unfortunately, the state just gave the county bad information.
So basically, though, that means
But I said this last week. I want to know who at the state made the decision. It bothers me.
I was advised it was the state comptroller is who they asked.
Well, they need to know who made that call. Actually, what person made that call. He needs to take the blame for this.
Well, I know it. They ought to at least mention the state comptroller's office gave them bad information or something instead of they got bad information, period. Anyway, it's, I hate that happened. I was reading on in this article, and it said what it means for the Bradley County school system is there will not be money for a salary increase for the next 2 years, and there will not be money for us to put in capital outlay projects.
It's got to come somewhere out of the budget.
But I understand, and I'm not saying that this is easy at all for them. Understand that this is money they already got 3 years ago to spend. So
to build a science,
had they put this money aside,
no, this was not designated for
actually,
that.
they saved a lot of that money from other accounts as well to build the science wing.
They may have used it toward that project, but that was not. It wasn't designated that way for that.
So the last 3 years they had extra money to spend, and now unfortunately they're going to have to figure out a way to put it back in. And I think Johnny McDaniel went to the city council, and I've fussed a lot about the county suing the city and the city suing the county and wasting taxpayer dollars on lawsuits. I do think it was a good thing to see our two forms of government, including school boards and commissions and councils, to be able to actually reasonably work out a way to fix this.
Let's give them all a big round of applause. They worked it out.
Well, desperate times call for desperate measures, apparently.
But now, Franklin, they could have sued. The county could have refused, or the city could have said, "Look, we want our money up front."
The city could have insisted we pay it all at one time, and they would have been right.
That's true. They would have been within their rights. But I think the city council did a good job and said, "Look, this is a tough situation all around. Ultimately, the taxpayer foots this bill no matter what." So I think everything worked out very reasonably.
All right. Way to go, city council. Way to go, county. Work together. We need to have a kumbaya song here to play or something.
We'll need hot chocolate.
Yeah. Hey, another thing I was looking at is a workhouse. Franklin, what do you think about a workhouse? I know we used to have one.
Sure. We also used to have a inmate population that was, dramatically smaller than it is now. It depends. When you read the articles about this, I don't think anybody's got any particular moral opposition to the concept or anything. But when I read the articles, what I see is them talking about it being a moneymaker. Well, that's a bad reason to be doing things in the criminal justice system, because it's a moneymaker. I don't like that in any other aspect of law enforcement, and if that's the motivation for it, then I think it's a bad idea. If it's a need to fill, then that's fine.
Well, I do think, from what I understand, the ACLU is against it. I know that I asked Dan Gilley years ago why we didn't have the guys out on the road crew picking up trash, and he said that he had been told by the lawyers that they would get sued because that was humiliating. Now, I have a hard time understanding that. I know the sheriff out in Arizona that everybody hates, Joe Arpaio, puts them in pink jumpsuits specifically to embarrass them.
Well, there are lots of places that have work crews that there's a question about, the kind of work that you do, and there's also costs associated with that. There's additional security required when you've got inmates out that way.
Well, frankly, they don't put mass murderers out on the road crew. They put DUIs. They put, bounce checks. They put nonviolent offenders.
You still got to have personnel out there with them.
Right, but it's not.
That.
It's
so
not
it's
like,
not like it's free.
No,
I'm just saying it's a lot more complicated than it sounds on the surface. Everybody says, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if we had these folks doing that?" Okay. But is there a cost associated with it? 2, are there risks associated with it? Those are fair questions to be asked, that ought to be asked. And then 3, what's the reason for doing it? Is it supposed to be making people more law-abiding citizens? or is it supposed to be generating money for the local coffers?
Well, Franklin, why does it have to be mutually exclusive?
It doesn't have to be. Those are questions that ought to be asked, though, and when the first articles that come out justifying it are talking about making money off of it, that's why you would talk about it.
Well, I'm sorry. As a capitalist, I don't have a problem with being motivated by making money. You know, the fact of the matter is it's going to cost something to have that guy sit in a jail cell doing nothing. So if it costs a little bit less to put him out on the road doing a job that needs to be done, it seems like a pretty good idea to me.
You know, we used to have a workhouse years ago, and I remember traveling over into Memphis. I used to work over around Memphis, and they had a juvenile court there, and right next to their juvenile court, it was like their old armory. Mm-hmm. You know, we used to have an armory here in town, which would have been perfect for this, by the way. But basically, they had that armory situation set up. They had a barbed wire, a fence, a big fence around it. And they had bunk beds in it. And it was kind of like an old army barracks. And basically what it was is all the DUI offenders came in over there on Fridays and checked in. And that's where they spent their weekends. And they didn't get in the population of the main prison system that way. And they had things for them to do, I guess.
Well, they do the same thing in Chattanooga at Silverdale down there. They've got basically a gymnasium with cots set up in it to handle DUI offenders.
But Silverdale is a private enterprise that's for profit.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not knocking the people who want to make a profit. I'm talking about the aspect of it where they're talking about it's a money maker for the government.
Well,
when you do law enforcement based upon a profit motive, I promise you're going to have problems because people aren't making decisions based upon right and wrong. They're basing it based upon the idea of making profit.
Well, I
That's
disagree from this standpoint, Franklin. I understand what you're talking about, and you're absolutely right. When they're out on the interstate and they're pulling cars over because they think that may have some money, I can get a hold of that. But when you're talking about the back end of the justice system, after a judge has sentenced someone, to simply ask them to work a little bit for that.
Nobody's talking about that, John.
Well, that's what this is talking about. It's talking. No, it's not. It's talking about making them work a little bit.
No, we're not. In theory, we could do that now. There's nothing stopping us from doing that.
Well,
we're talking about some private company coming in, operating this thing, and generating enough money to pay money back to the county as a profit.
But that's what Silverdale does that you just talked about.
Well, except that they're not paying much back to the county.
Well, they may not, but they're not costing it. I mean, the point here is to save taxpayer money. And if you could actually make a little bit of money for the taxpayer, why would we be against that?
As I said, when we started this conversation out, if that's the primary motivation for doing it, there's going to be problems.
Well, no one said it's the primary motivation.
That's the first justification
Franklin,
they gave.
Forget the money. Forget money.
Yeah.
Are you for a workhouse or not? Yay or nay?
I am for expanding the things that inmates do to be productive. So if there's I don't have any I don't have no
wait a minute. I want to take John and you and put you two together here for a minute.
Okay.
John is saying the same thing. Somehow money got brought up.
Well, that's because
forget the money. But you're both saying the same thing, that you want inmates to be productive. Is that what you just said?
Well, there's another aspect to this, too. One of the things that I think the ACLU and the ultra mamby-pamby groups do is they increase the cost that it takes to run a jail and to build a jail. They say, oh, it's got to have this and it's got to have that. And then after they get that cost inflated, then they turn around and say, oh, look what it costs to put these nonviolent people in jail. It's too expensive. We should get rid of these laws. This is a way to say, fine, what we're going to do is we're not going to build a big, expensive jail. We're going to build a barracks-type situation, which is good enough for our armed forces, and we're going to take the nonviolent offenders, and we're going to put them in this lower cost per inmate situation, and we might actually ask them to work a little bit for that. So I see it more from the standpoint of it pulls inmate numbers out of these expensive, high-security facilities that perhaps don't need to be there in the first place.
Let me ask this: if a inmate went into that program, a DUI offender or whatever, goes into that program, and they do voluntarily do work, that lowers their amount of time that they have to stay there.
Can't do that.
Well, Why can't it? Let me ask you something. Why can't it?
Well, DUI offenses have mandatory jail sentences involved.
Okay.
The judge doesn't have any discretion in lowering those. I mean, I guess if the judge gave you more, you could do that, but that's not a precedent that's going to save you money if you're keeping them there longer than necessary.
Maybe we ought to look at letting the judge have the power to do it.
Well, the problem is,
we
Steve,
used to do that.
DUI
and we don't trust people to do their jobs anymore.
Well, but the problem with the DUI, though, is you had too many people that were having multiples. They weren't really getting any time. And the time, what is it, 2 days the first time, Franklin? I mean, how much you gonna lower that to 1 day? Hell, they're just barely getting the alcohol out of their system.
Actually, I think a DUI is a bad way to look at this because there's other.
It's a big chunk. It's a big chunk of it.
Yeah.
I'll tell you this though: you take DUI and you take simple possession of marijuana offenses out of it, and you take a big chunk out of the weekly census.
Yeah.
In the facilities.
Well, the point is, if you could move those people into a lower cost per inmate situation, you would save the county taxpayer money.
Yeah. Well,
that's a good example, though. I mean, you can argue the pros or the cons of it, but
too bad we tore our armory down. We wouldn't have the cost of a building or a facility.
Well, you know why our DUI laws have gotten tougher?
Why?
Everybody
mad, sad, and glad, I guess.
Well, that's the prevailing view, but it's not accurate. Why?
Yeah.
Because federal highway dollars are tied to you having certain blood alcohol levels on your DUI law.
Now say that again.
If you don't have certain standards for what constitutes a DUI in your state, okay, blood alcohol levels and so forth,
right,
you don't get certain federal highway dollars in your state. Consequently, suddenly we got a rush to do that.
Mad, sad, and glad got to them there, didn't they?
Oh, I'm sure they have some impact on it. Of course they do. Of course they do. But what I'm telling you is that's not the sole motivation. Money's got a lot to do with it.
Mm-hmm. There's another article here, Making Crime Pay. Federal cases in East Tennessee brought in $69 million in 2 years. So here's an article in today's time, and the only reason I'm talking about it is from your conversation about profits in courts and so forth. It says that U.S. attorneys say justice pays for itself. Total collections and fines and forfeitures by federal prosecutors in the region for the past 3 years have been more than 2.5 times the office's total appropriated operating budgets for 2010, 11, and 12, according to William Killen, head of the district office. In 2011, U.S. attorneys in East Tennessee collected $44 million, a record high, and in 2012 they brought in $24.8 million in criminal and civil actions. Both years were high compared to that. Just over $22.5 million of fiscal 2012 money was in civil actions, and they were mostly for healthcare fraud violations.
Yeah, and if you go on into the article, that's $5.3 million that Erlanger had to pay to the government. So, and I'm certainly not supporting Erlanger in that regard, but you have to do the math in it to follow the money. Right. That means that patients and taxpayers, because Erlanger's a public facility, ended up paying money back to the government because of erroneous billing practices. That's happened to a local company here in the last 2 weeks. Pretty significant amount.
Which company was that?
Life Care's under investigation for that. So there's definitely a money factor driving some of these prosecutions, good or bad.
Well, it's not just prosecutions. I can tell you, I'm on the board at the Bradley Healthcare and Rehabilitation Center, and we had a really large fine from the federal government, a fine. This is just purely within these departments for basically a policy that had been in place for years that they had never had a problem with before. And I at least personally got the idea that this was sort of making up a budget crunch in this department. They got much harder to deal with. And from my standpoint, it was difficult because we're not a for-profit entity. We are owned by the county, although We don't cost the county a single dime. We provide a service. We pay our own way. But we took a huge fine to the federal government, and they were not very reasonable to deal with about it.
What was the fine pertaining to, John?
It was just a policy that had been in place for years, and they came in and decided this year that policy wasn't adequate. And so it gets complicated. They have about a 6-month window to come into your facility. Well, they came in the last week they could come in, and this supposed incident that involved this policy happened 3 or 4 months earlier. Well, they fine you per day, and so the fine was huge. And you look at that and you go, so if you had come in the first week of this window, the fine would have been almost nothing. But because you came in 4 months later, this fine is, the infraction, which again was just a policy type infraction, is the same. But based on when you choose to come into our facility, it goes from a $4,000 or $5,000, $8,000 fine to a $400,000 fine. Explain the logic of that.
It doesn't make logic. Seems to me like their fining system is out of whack.
Well, they're funding themselves through these fines. Yeah. That's a problem.
And that's really the point that I was making. We've talked about it on the local level and so forth. I am uncomfortable frequently with government funding being determined by these types of things.
I'm glad you said that. What about the Financial Reform Act that Mr. Obama's putting out right now?
What do you mean?
Well, basically, they've put together a group of people that basically go in, they audit these companies, they're the judge, the jury, and they're the ones that set fine, and they're funded by the fines that they create.
That's pretty much what we're talking about.
Well, and that's worth discussion and looking at. Well, it's just amazing how much of government is actually funded by these types of things.
One of the reasons the founders wanted a very limited government was because the bigger this government gets, the more difficult it becomes to actually follow the money. For example, and we bragged on the city council, and I think this city council's trying to do a good job, but in the past they've put a lot of fees in place. Well, what's the difference in a fee and a tax? There's no difference at all, but it gets them out of having to say we raised your taxes.
There's not a difference, but here's where I'm going to
well, my point just frankly was the bigger government gets, the more money they look for and the more odd ways they find it.
Well, here's what I would suggest to you, John, as a small government conservative. Okay, if you really believe that, you ought to get rid of all these fees and require the government to make its decisions strictly on a tax, period. So people could have a fair up assessment of whether they really want this service and whether they want to pay for it or not. What happens now is we hide the cost of these by generating the money in these other mechanisms.
Isn't that what I just? I'm glad. You and I are in agreement.
But that's what I'm saying. We might not agree on whether we need a service or not,
but
or
we
whether
would at
the
least
tax
have
ought to
an
be higher or
open
lower.
discussion.
But that's the way it ought to be talked
agree.
about. And all of this anti-tax rhetoric that we deal with emboldens them to look for these other revenue sources, and it prevents us from having a fair, straight-up debate on whether the service is good, whether it's needed, and what it costs to pay for it.
Well, but Franklin,
it just creates fuzzy math.
The thing that emboldens them to do this is buying votes through services. And if they had to actually tell the public, oh, by the way, you'll actually have to pay for this service, the public wouldn't give them their vote. So this is all about a politician protecting his office, protecting his tenure in office.
That might be.
I've got a little example. I had example of some of this. Excuse me. I had a party that was interested in renting some space for a real estate office. They had to apply to the state of Tennessee and pay some fees and so forth to be able to do this. And then one of the things is the state of Tennessee turns around and sends a packet of things that he needs to provide, insurance and some of these type of things. But one of them was a zoning letter, and the zoning letter was $25 at City of Cleveland. You know, basically you go in and look and see how something's
So this guy's
done.
not doing anything in our community yet. We're actually hoping he will, but it's going to cost him $25 just to even think about it.
Yeah. Well, he had to get a zoning letter, and that's a $25 fee for basically them to type up a letter and say this is a such and such zone commercial.
What do you want to bet that zoning letter is in a format
It
that
is.
you just put the company
Basically,
name in and
they
the
pull it out and just kind
address
of make
and
a
that's it.
photostatic copy of it. But, I mean, you know, that's how I guess that's how they justify the clerks down there and some of these people. And, you know, Nashville, they're charging fees if you have to make applications over there. You know, you got to pay a fee over there, and then you got to come over here and pay fees. So there's fees everywhere.
Well, but my point, and I think Franklin was saying the same thing, a fee is a tax. It's just not a tax we actually get to discuss and debate.
Yeah. Well, I just got back from this seminar in Nashville, and part of what we went over is all the new laws that have been passed by the General Assembly this year. And we've got a bunch of them.
You know, I was over in Nashville. I wish I could have joined you over there.
Well, you'd have been welcome. But
was it Democrats, Republicans, or both?
It was lawyers.
It was worse.
So, you
It was
know,
lawyers.
Democrats.
Yeah. But there's some really
About
interesting
15-20% Republican, about 80% Democrat.
some really interesting laws that have come out this year.
Tell me so.
Did you know that now, if a cemetery buries your loved one in the wrong place, you can't sue them for it. And they're immune from digging your loved one back up and moving them to where they were supposed to put them in the first place.
How'd they get enough power to get that one voted?
Apparently they do. Okay. There's a new law that if the state's doing an execution, okay, the warden has to permit 3 relatives or close friends of the victim to attend an execution if the victim has no immediate family members. So he needs to go find 3 friends of the victim.
No, wait a minute.
Well, now, Franklin, let me posit just a hypothetical. Let's say a guy breaks into a house, and this has happened, unfortunately, in our country, and he murders everybody in the house. He murders the father, the mother, and the children. Grandparents have already passed away, but there's a brother, or there's even a cousin who
Well, that's an
fights
immediate family member or brother.
Well, is a cousin?
No.
Well, let's say the cousin is left, and he fights for justice for this family member, and he wants to attend. This law basically says somebody from the family can attend.
I'm just thinking this probably isn't a big issue.
Well, it is if you're the cousin.
We don't have a lot of executions anyway, and even when we do, it's not really a big deal. I'm just talking about the fact
when's the last time we even had an execution in Tennessee?
It's been a couple of years.
This is what the General Assembly is spending its time on. Now, here's an interesting one that could potentially affect a lot of people. Okay, licenses issued by the Department of Commerce and Insurance, and licenses required to work as athlete agents, lobbyists, and here's the interesting part, and K through 12 public school teachers are to be denied, suspended, or revoked if student loans are not paid. That means if you're a teacher and you get behind on your student loan,
right,
your license to teach could be revoked.
That's good, isn't it?
Well, I don't know, because the law doesn't define what not paying them is. If you got in a car accident and you exceeded your leave and you didn't get paid for 2 weeks, or you didn't get paid for 2 months while you were recuperating, is your license suspended at that point? That's the question.
Well, Franklin, the Obama administration has nationalized all the student loans, and one of the programs that they put in place, which, by the way, loans ungodly amounts of money to people, irregardless of their ability to pay, can seize every asset that you have. The federal government steps in, takes everything you own if you don't pay it back. Well, and they're the ones that they loan more than you can pay back in the first place.
Well, you know, I guess I'm for it. If the government is in the loan business, I think somebody should be in charge of getting it paid back.
I'm not opposed to paying it back, and by the way, payments of student loans have gone up the last 4 years. And number two, second, what you said,
Franklin, it depends on which. There's a lot of different departments that do these different types of loans. The one I'm talking about, Franklin, has unbelievable failure rates.
Well, part of that was a response to the failure rates.
No, the biggest problem with that program was they were loaning a cab driver who makes $50,000 a year. They were loaning him $400,000 to send his daughter to Columbia, and there was no reasonable way he would ever be able to pay that back.
John, that's only happened in the last 24 months that the government has taken
these
these
Obama
overs.
administration.
No, hold on a minute. It was in response to a problem that had already been determined and was existing in the private sector out there. I mean, you forget that the government was already backing up these loans beforehand. All we did was take the middleman out and thereby lower the cost.
Well,
of
a
it.
lot of us don't think they should have been backing them up.
Well,
that's the whole problem. Once
maybe so, John, but there's a lot of people, me included,
in bed with industry. The problem's not industry. The problem is crony capitalism, where the government's in bed with industry.
Well, let me ask you something. This whole conversation came up from something you read about a school teacher who is teaching school, who gets behind in paying back a student loan, can have her license pulled.
That's right.
Okay. Do you know that an attorney,
same thing, by the way,
that an attorney who owes back child support
can have his license suspended?
Cannot have his license
suspended.
suspended.
That's not true. They certainly can.
I tell you what, I'll bet you $5 on that.
Now, the last bet we made, I'm still waiting on my steak dinner.
No. I'll bet you $5 that I'm correct on that. That is the only group that cannot have their license taken away from them.
That's not what they're telling us.
Unless it's changed in the last few years.
Fortunately, I'm current.
I used to be in the business of collecting child support.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So it was amazing to me that we found doctors all over the country and everything else that we could pull their license until they got their child support. We found an attorney in Michigan one time that owed about $350,000, and we could not pull his license.
Well, that would have been some law in Michigan. We're talking about law in the state of Tennessee.
The licenses are issued on state basis, so that may be true.
And I'm telling you, in Tennessee, that's not the case.
In some states,
that may be. I couldn't argue that. By the way, it's also now a crime in Tennessee to release a wild boar back into the wild. Do you know that?
Well, actually, I
don't know what that's about, but
I can tell you exactly what that's about. That's a big issue. That's a huge issue. You know, Franklin, part of the problem is the legislature addresses the needs of all the citizens, and there may
tell
be
us about it.
Wild boar all across the southeastern United States and now out into Texas and Oklahoma. Wild boar are an incredibly mean, incredibly destructive animal. They're also incredibly good at propagating their species. A wild boar will have about 3 litters a year. There'll be anywhere from 6, 8, 10 piglets in the litter. They're fun to hunt. You hunt them with dogs, and I've hunted them for years. But Tennessee was having a problem with people illegally trapping them, hauling them to other parts of the state.
It was farmers basically trapping them.
No.
Wasn't farmers?
No, that's the problem. Farmers, if they trapped them, they killed them.
Right, okay.
The hunters were trapping them, taking them to the other parts of the states and releasing them because they wanted to be able to hunt them there. Well, once you release them in there, they're, like I said, they're a very aggressive breeding species. And so the state Wildlife Resources Agency was trying to control that. Now, I personally don't agree with the way they did that. They cut out the hunting season because they said, well, hunters, they're doing this because they want to hunt them. If we take away the pressure for hunting, then that'll take away the pressure to move them. My point was it was already illegal to trap them and move them. Why don't you prosecute the people you catch doing this and do it that way rather than punish the hunters? But this was a huge environmental issue that the legislature was trying to deal with, Franklin.
All right, give us another law that's changed there, Franklin.
If you're in an accident now that involves death or serious bodily injury and you lack a valid driver's license and or proof of financial responsibility, that's insurance, you now must be arrested and taken into custody. Apparently has nothing to do with whether you were at fault in the accident or not.
Well,
interesting.
Well, I mean, is that a bad thing?
I don't know.
I mean, is that not the law before the law?
Sure it is. We're all supposed to have insurance
and a driver's license.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd say that's probably.
Well,
but
I mean, what happens
but
is,
but if you're not in an accident, you get a traffic ticket for that. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in this particular case, you're in an accident, and you might not be at fault. You may not have done anything wrong. according to this, they do not have the ability to cite you into court. You must be arrested and placed into custody.
Well, I
Think
guess
about
that's
it. Whether
an
it's good or
extra
bad.
pressure to make sure you have your license if you're going to be driving.
Yeah.
Let me say this. This is not a Republican or Democrat issue.
I didn't say anything about Republicans.
No, I know. I'm prefacing what I'm getting ready to say. Most of my experience is with talking to Republican legislators, but most of these bills come up because a constituent calls and says, hey, I have a problem in this area. Here's something I've experienced. I don't think this is right. Can you see if there's a way to address this? And that's where these bills come from. So, Franklin, this isn't them sitting around going, hey, what can we do? This is the people of the state of Tennessee contacting their representatives and say, we have a concern in this area. Now, you're right. You may not like the boar hunting. You don't hunt wild boar, so that seemed like a silly issue to you. But to people that hunt boar, and more importantly, to not only farmers, but to environmentalists, the boar issue is a huge issue.
I know the boars have been a big problem for farmers lately.
Well, actually,
crops and everything else.
Nobody cared when it was just the farmers, but once the forestry people got involved and started saying, look, you all need to come see what kind of damage they do to the forest floor, and start damaging the ecosystem, that's when this actually started to shift a little bit. But my point simply is, it's easy to pick through this and say, oh, I don't understand this, but these legislators react to their constituents.
All right, give us another one. You got one more before we take a break?
Well, let's see here. There's now a group of counties in Tennessee, I don't know why it's only some counties as opposed to all of them, where the training season for coon dogs is now 6 months long instead of, it was a shorter period before, apparently.
Well, because of the Wildlife Resources Agency. If you want to talk about coon hunting, we'll talk about coon hunting now.
I'm just saying.
Franklin obviously doesn't know a whole lot about hunting.
Well, there are areas
I used to
where
go hunting a lot when I was in high school.
Okay.
But I hadn't been on a coon dog hunt in a long time, so apparently they've got quite a lobby.
Well, the problem, a lot of this is dog hunting. For example, they have coon seasons, and the Wildlife Resources people worry that when they're out in the woods at night coon hunting with lights, that they're maybe illegally hunting boar, which is illegal to hunt them at night.
Dear.
You hunt the boar during the day. So a lot of these laws are trying to regulate and curb illegal activity.
Okay. Let's take a break. We'll be back in just a minute.
You're listening to Backfire with Steve Hickson. We'll be right back after this.
You are listening to WOOP-LP, Cleveland, Tennessee. WOOP FM is a broadcasting service of the Traditional Music Resource Center, and we play America's original music.
Are you looking for the best beer and cigarette prices in Bradley County?